In June of 1941, a young Navy corpsman stepped off a transport ship and onto the steamy docks of Manila Bay. Charles Conrad Beckner had finished hospital corps school in San Diego, crossed the Pacific, and reported for duty with Patrol Wing 10 at the Cavite Navy Yard. He was 20 years old, a farm boy from Princeton, Indiana, and the only thing he carried that truly felt like his own was a heavy-bladed hospital corps knife issued during training. The blade was thick and solid, designed more for prying and cutting than for fighting, and he kept it sharp out of habit. At Cavite, Beckner learned the rhythms of the seaplane base. He helped refuel PBY Catalinas, passed tools to the motormacs, and treated the usual run of cuts and fevers among the men. It was a lazy, tropical duty, and everyone knew war was coming, but nobody knew how fast. On the afternoon of December 8th, Philippine time, the news came over the radio: Pearl Harbor had been bombed. Hours later, Japanese planes appeared over Luzon. Charles Conrad Beckner was at the dispensary near Canyacao Hospital when the first bombs hit the Navy Yard. The shock wave smashed windows, and the wounded began arriving within minutes, burned, bleeding, some with limbs torn away. Beckner worked through the night and into the following days, packing wounds, splinting fractures, and handing out quinine to men shaking with malaria and fear. The peacetime Navy had trained him for this, but nothing in the classroom or the drill field had prepared him for the smell of scorched flesh and the sound of grown men crying for their mothers. The war in the Philippines had begun, and for Beckner it would not end for 4 more years. Within days, the decision came down. Patrol Wing 10 would evacuate to Bataan and Corregidor. The big PBY seaplanes that Beckner had helped service and refuel now faced destruction or a desperate flight south to Australia. One by one, the surviving Catalinas lifted off from Manila Bay or were burned on the ramp to prevent capture. Beckner watched them go, understanding he was not going with them. He moved with the remnants of the wing across the channel to Corregidor, then to the jungled slopes of Bataan. There was no proper evacuation plan for the ground crews. Men who had maintained aircraft now found themselves without planes and without clear orders. Beckner reported to the Beach Defense Unit near the naval base at Mariveles, where malaria and dysentery were already taking a heavier toll than Japanese bullets. He set up a sick bay and a nipa hut and treated the fevers and the bloody stools of men who had nothing left but their rifles and their resolve. In late January 1942, a new opportunity appeared. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had arrived in the Philippines only months before the war. Their commander, a hard-driving lieutenant commander named John Duncan Bulkley, needed men who could handle a machine gun and a bandage at the same time. Beckner volunteered. He was assigned to PT-41 as a gunner and corpsman. The boat was a 77-foot wooden shell armed with 4 torpedoes and twin 50 caliber machine guns. The 50 calibers were heavy air-cooled weapons that could tear through thin steel at close range, but they vibrated violently when fired and required constant maintenance. On the night of January 23, 1942, 3 PT boats slipped out of Sisseman Cove and headed west into Subic Bay. It was the squadron's first combat patrol. Japanese ships lay anchored off the coast, protected by shore batteries and destroyers. The boats entered under a moonless sky, engines throttled to a whisper. Lookouts spotted a large transport and a destroyer. Bulkley gave the order to attack. Beckner, standing in the starboard turret of PT-41, gripped the grips of his 50 caliber and waited for the first flash of enemy fire. The torpedoes ran hot and true. One struck the transport with a shuddering blast that lit the bay. Shore batteries opened up immediately, throwing orange geysers around the speeding boats. Searchlights stabbed across the water. Bulkley ordered evasive maneuvers, throwing the helm hard over while his gunners raked the searchlights with 50 caliber fire. Wooden hulls pounded through the swell as the boats raced for the mouth of the bay, outrunning the Japanese shells. They escaped with only minor damage, but had proven that PT boats could strike at the heart of an invasion force and survive. In mid-February, Lieutenant Commander Bulkley, he had just been promoted, received an urgent request from Bataan. A force of 296 Philippine scout cadets was trapped on the beach near Limay, with Japanese infantry closing in. The scouts were teenagers, boy soldiers being trained as officers. Bulkley committed his boats to the rescue. Under cover of darkness, the PTs slid onto the beach. The cadets, many of them sick and half-starved, waded through the surf and clambered aboard. Beckner helped haul them over the gunwales, counting heads in the dark, packing them into every inch of deck space until the boats sat low in the water. The boats pulled away as Japanese patrols opened fire from the tree line. Not a single cadet was left behind. The crossing to Corregidor took hours, the overloaded PT boats wallowing through a rough sea. Beckner moved among the boys, checking for wounds, distributing canteens, speaking in the quiet Tagalog he had picked up at Cavite. They reached the island before dawn. The cadets were marched up the dock and into the tunnel system alive because a handful of sailors in wooden boats had risked everything to bring them out. March brought the final collapse. On the 11th day of the month, PT-32, one of the squadron's original 6 boats, ran aground on a reef during a resupply mission to the southern islands. The crew managed to refloat her, but the damage was severe and fuel had become contaminated. The squadron's strength was now effectively down to just 3 operational boats. Beckner watched the damage reports come in, knowing the attrition would only get worse. That same night, March 11, 1942, Bulkley received his most critical order. General Douglas MacArthur was to be evacuated from Corregidor and delivered to Mindanao, from where he could fly to Australia and assume command of the Allied counteroffensive. The Japanese blockade was tightening and every hour counted. 4 PT boats would make the run: PT-41, PT-34, PT-35, and the undermanned PT-32. Beckner climbed into his gun turret aboard PT-41 as the boats cast off into the moonless darkness. Behind them, the guns of Corregidor rumbled a final salute. The voyage covered 560 miles of Japanese-controlled sea. Enemy destroyers patrolled the channels, and aircraft scourged the coast at first light. PT-32 had to be scuttled en route, her fuel contaminated, her crew transferred. The 3 remaining boats pushed on, running at low speed to conserve fuel, hiding in coves during daylight. Beckner stayed at his gun, scanning the sky for float planes. At dusk on March 13th, they raised the coast of Mindanao. MacArthur stepped ashore at the village of Bugo. Beckner helped secure the perimeter, his hand steady on the .50 caliber. They had delivered the general, and with that mission, Squadron 3 had written its first chapter into history. After delivering General Douglas MacArthur to Mindanao in the dark hours of March 13th, the survivors of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 dropped into a rare pause. Lieutenant Commander Bulkley ordered a holiday routine for the crew, a brief rest before whatever came next. On Sunday morning, an Army bus carried the Catholic sailors into Cagayan for Mass at the old San Agustin Cathedral. Beckner broke away from the group and walked to a small chapel at the Ateneo de Cagayan. Months before the war, at a naval hospital in California, he had met a Navy nurse named Mary Tallulah Finian, Tilly to everyone who knew her. She had befriended him, shared stories of the Philippines, and made him promise that if war came and they were separated, neither would ever forget. He had not seen her since arriving in the islands. Inside the cool, dim space, he saw a table with votive candles flickering in an iron rack and dropped his last 100-peso note into the wooden box. He took 2 candles and lit them, one for Tilly and one for the lost crew of PT-32, who had vanished into the sea weeks before. A priest appeared behind him and spoke in English. The man introduced himself as Edward Haggerty, the American Jesuit rector of the Ateneo, and Beckner admitted he was not Catholic, but had come to light a candle for a friend. Haggerty invited him to join the Paradis family for Sunday dinner, and Beckner spent the afternoon at their table, enjoying a meal with one of the leading families of Cagayan and listening to their plans to survive the coming Japanese occupation. Back at Bugo, the squadron resumed its watch. On the night of March 18th, PT-34 began dragging anchor and crashed onto a coral reef, and when Lieutenant Robert Bowling Kelly pulled on the anchor cable, it came up slack in his hands, the broken shackle pin lost somewhere in the dark water. Every wave pushed the boat harder onto the reef, and by dawn she sat high and dry on the coral. The crew fought for 2 days to free her. Army laborers dynamited a channel through the reef. But the tugboats that arrived were too small to budge the wooden hull, and high tide came and went with the boat still stuck fast. By the second night, the men were exhausted and out of ideas. Near midnight, a punt approached carrying army officers and a priest. Father Edward Haggerty stepped onto the deck, and radioman David Goodman called out for a blessing. Haggerty raised his hand and prayed for strength, and on the second amen, the boat slid cleanly from the coral into the cleared passage. The crew cheered, and Beckner shouted, "Is this your first miracle?" On the night of March 20th, Bulkley received orders to evacuate Philippine President Manuel Quezon from the island of Negros. PT-41 and PT-34 sailed into waters patrolled by Japanese destroyers, carrying a guide named Soriano, whom Bulkley distrusted so deeply he posted armed guards over him with orders to shoot at the first sign of betrayal. Soriano proved loyal, and the boats reached the port of Dumaguete without incident. At Dumaguete, the tide was too low to use the dock, so Bulkley waded ashore with a Thompson submachine gun in his hands and confronted a local constable who refused to reveal Quezon's location. Bulkley pressed the gun to the man's head, and the constable changed his mind and directed them up the coast to a village called Bias. There, Quezon waited in a nipa hut, frightened by the bearded, filthy sailors, but finally agreeing to board PT-41. As the boats prepared to leave, PT-35 radioed that she had struck a reef at full speed and was taking on water through a major breach in the hull. Both boats turned back and recovered PT-35's entire crew, then stuffed them aboard alongside Quezon, his wife, 3 children, his personal priest, the vice president, and several cabinet officers. The overloaded boats fought heavy seas and delivered Quezon to Oroquieta on the Mindanao coast before dawn. In the first week of April, the squadron moved to Opon on Mactan Island near Cebu for repairs on both PT-34 and PT-35. Beckner came down with dengue fever, a brutal illness that drove his temperature above 104 degrees and threw him into violent hallucinations. He collapsed at the home of his host, Enrique Aboitiz, and lay unconscious for 2 days while a priest administered last rites. In the darkness and confusion of those fever-dream nights, Bulkley received word that a Japanese cruiser with 4 destroyers was steaming south through the Cebu Channel. PT-34 sortied with a reduced crew. Pappy Reynolds took the port 50 calibers, while Harris climbed into Beckner's usual starboard turret. In the darkness, the boat closed to 300 yards and launched 2 torpedoes, both striking the cruiser Kuma amidships. The Japanese return fire raked PT-34 from bow to stern. A round struck Reynolds in the neck and shoulder, and another tore through torpedoman Harris's chin into his brain, killing him instantly. The crippled boat beached on a small island, and Japanese seaplanes found her at dawn and finished her with bombs. Reynolds died of his wounds on shore, and the survivors were taken to Southern Islands Hospital in Cebu City. On April 9th, while Beckner still lay weak from dengue fever at the Aboitiz house, word arrived that Bataan had surrendered. More than 70,000 American and Filipino soldiers became prisoners of war, and Japanese forces were closing on Cebu itself. The last PT boat, PT-35, still sat on blocks at the Opon shipyard with her hull repairs unfinished. Lieutenant Branningham ordered the crew to destroy PT-35 rather than let her fall into enemy hands. Men carried a torpedo warhead into the engine compartment and lit 2 fuses, and the explosion tore the boat apart, sending debris across the shipyard. Branningham pried off her aluminum nameplate and nailed it to a nearby tree as a marker for the Navy to find when it returned. Beckner, still dizzy and aching, attended the burial of Reynolds and Harris in a cemetery at the edge of Cebu City. Ensign Ilif Richardson had arranged the service with a local priest, and Father Luke, the Redemptorist who had administered last rites to Beckner 2 days earlier, said the words over 2 rough wood coffins. Beckner returned to the city to find his squadron gone, and with Japanese patrols already on the streets, he began walking north along a jungle path with nothing but his medical kit, his knife, and the determination to reach Australia on his own. The path was dark, and Charles Beckner was still weak. The dengue fever had drained him, and every step cost him more than he had to give. He heard voices ahead and dropped flat into the undergrowth, pulling his pistol from its holster. A Japanese patrol of 7 men passed within yards of where he lay. One soldier stopped, leaned his rifle against a tree, and squatted a few feet from Beckner's hiding place. The corpsman held his breath, willing his body into the earth. Minutes that felt like hours passed before the patrol moved on and the trail fell silent again. Dawn found him at a farmer's hut on the slope of the mountain. The farmer's wife gave him a bowl of cornmeal chicken and would not take his pesos, so Beckner traded a waterproof vial of matches. He slept a few hours in their lean-to, then pushed on toward the coast. By moonlight, he reached a village on the western shore. Bancas pulled up on the sand. He tried to launch one, but his dengue-ravaged arms could not move it. Then shapes appeared in the starlight, men approaching along the beach. He drew his pistol and crouched. A whispered voice came in English, and Beckner knew it at once. It was his own squadron. He stood and helped them push the largest outrigger into the surf. Lieutenant Brantingham was there with 8 other crewmen, all trying to reach Negros the same way Beckner had attempted alone. Together they sailed west across the Tanyon Strait, the Banca's single sail catching a steady southern breeze. By dawn of April 12th, they pulled the boat onto the sand of Negros Island, free of Cebu for the first time in days. They hired trucks south along the coast road and reached Dumaguete by the afternoon of April 13th. From there, fishermen carried them across the strait to Dipolog on Mindanao. Another truck took them to the Del Monte airfield, but the evacuation list held 400 names and no plane for them. Brantingham did not wait. He loaded the men onto a bus and drove up the winding mountain road to Camp Keithley on the shore of Lake Lanao. At Camp Keithley, Beckner found the rest of the squadron survivors gathered in a single barracks. He walked through the door and saw John Xavier Balog, the chief pharmacist's mate who had served with him on the boats. Balog threw his arms around him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The column of survivors in the room fell silent, watching 2 corpsmen who had made it out of the chaos still breathing. Beckner found Bill Johnson, a machinist mate from the squadron, lying in a corner bunk with a malaria fever that would not break. The quinine had failed. Beckner opened his medical kit and pulled out 3 Etabrine tablets, the same supply he had bought from Dr. Torres in Cebu. He forced Johnson to swallow them. Within hours, the fever broke. Days later, Ensign Ross Hoffman arrived at the camp with a classified mission. 2 PBY seaplanes would land on Lake Lanao to evacuate key personnel, and the squadron needed to prepare a hidden refueling site on a small island. Beckner was ordered to help. For the next 2 weeks, Beckner worked with a handful of sailors and soldiers to prepare the island. They moved barrels of aviation fuel by Banca, cut tree limbs to camouflage the berthing coves, and bolted old truck tires to the shore as fenders. On the night of April 29th, the rumble of 4 engines echoed across the lake. 2 black-painted PBY Catalinas dropped from the clouds and touched down on the dark water. Small boats guided them to the coves, where the crews tied them under the overhanging branches. Commander Neal climbed through the nose hatch of the first PBY. He was Beckner's old squadron commander from Patrol Wing 10 in Cavite. Neal looked at the gaunt corpsman standing on the shore and recognized him at once. Without hesitation, he said Beckner was back in the wing and would fly out on the return trip. Beckner's long walk from Cebu through farmers' huts and jungle trails and Japanese patrols had finally reached its end. Dawn came at Lake Lanao on April 30th. The seaplanes had landed the night before. Commander Neal and his crew were already loading passengers. Beckner scanned the faces of the nurses stepping onto the island. He recognized one dark-haired woman from the jungle hospital on Bataan. He asked her about Tilly. She shook her head. Tilly had not been among those evacuated from Corregidor. He turned away from the second PBY and walked toward the water's edge, where the first plane was being prepared for boarding. He climbed through the waist hatch just as the Moro boat began to pull them from the cove. She might have escaped by submarine. She might still be on the rock. He had no way to know. For now, there was no time to grieve. Commander Neal's voice cut through the thin air. It was time to board. The Moro boat with its putt-putt engine pulled the first PBY from the cove. Beckner stood in the waist compartment and watched the water. He saw something below the surface. "Rocks!" he shouted to the cockpit. Lieutenant Thomas Pollock shouted back and prepared to take off. The Banca pulled the nose around too fast, An underwater ledge caught the hull. The PBY shuddered and stopped. Water began pouring in through a tear in the aluminum. Men scrambled to the aft compartment. The hole was 18 inches long, an L-shaped rip in the skin. Passengers bailed with buckets. The bilge pump had failed. Ensign Hoffman cut his forehead when the plane beached and needed treatment. Captain Joe McGuigan, a Cavite Navy Yard ship repair officer, waded into the water. He stripped to his skivvies and dove under the hull. He said he could fix it with wood, rubber, and a blanket. For 12 hours, McGuigan led the repair. Soldiers cut branches. A parachute blanket was pulled under the hull and lashed tight. Sponge rubber from a harness stuffed the larger hole. Marines glued canvas patches over the smaller tiers. Donkey pumps sucked water in bursts. By late afternoon, the PBY floated higher. Japanese trucks were grinding down the Ganassi Road. The sound of engines echoed across the lake. With darkness approaching, Pollock ran the engines cold. The patch was not watertight. It was only hope. A larger Army launch pulled the PBY from the cove. Pollock pushed the throttles full forward. The hull pounded against the waves. After a long run, the plane rose to the step. Then the blanket blew loose from the hull. A taut rope flapped against the tail. Water rushed back into the waist compartment. Beckner saw the mountainside rushing at them. There was no time to think. Beckner pulled his core knife from his belt and swung at the rope in a single hard arc. The rope parted. The blanket fluttered away. Tail control returned. Pollock began the shallowest turn he dared. Treetops slapped the bottom of the hull once, twice, then fell away. The PBY, still leaking, rose above the ridges. Pollock banked the plane west toward the open ocean. The men in the waist compartment let out one ragged breath. They flew through the night in silence. Captain McGuigan crawled back to the repair and wedged timber against the patch with his feet. It held. At dawn, Darwin came into view. Small, burnt, and barely standing after the Japanese bombing, it looked like paradise. Pollock dropped the PBY onto the water. The hull bounced 3 times. The patch bulged but did not break. Pollock taxied to a shallow pier and cut the engines. For the first time in 5 months, Beckner stepped onto free ground. After the war, Charles Conrad Beckner continued his Navy career, retiring as a chief warrant officer after 31 years of service. He kept his promise to Tilly never to forget her, and her memory shaped the rest of his life. He died in February 2009 and was buried at Arlington with full military honors. John Duncan Bulkley received the Medal of Honor and retired as an admiral after 55 years of service. Lieutenant Brantingham, who refused to abandon his men, made it home. Robert Bowling Kelly survived the war, commanded a destroyer at Okinawa, and retired as a captain. John Xavier Balog married in Australia and lived until 1973. Bill Johnson survived the war, became a dentist, and later wrote to Beckner thanking him for saving his life with those Atabrine tablets. Elif Richardson survived as a guerrilla on Leyte, was rescued by a U.S. destroyer, and was personally commissioned by General MacArthur. Father Edward Haggerty served the guerrilla resistance until his evacuation in 1944, and later wrote his memoirs. The story of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 ends not in defeat, but in the simple fact of survival. 3 of the squadron's original 6 boats were lost in action. Others were destroyed to prevent capture, but every man who could reach Australia did so through the desperate ingenuity of a few dedicated sailors and the quiet determination of a ship repair officer who refused to let his patch fail. It is a story of endurance measured not in victory, but in the small choices that kept men alive until they could fight again. If you have a family story from the Pacific War or a memory of a veteran who served in the Philippines, we would like to hear it in the comments below. We read every one. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so that more people can discover these incredible accounts of courage and perseverance. Thank you for listening.